Daniel Carroll Toomey is a graduate of the University of Maryland and the author of 10 books, some of which are out front. The Civil War in Maryland, Marylanders at Gettysburg, and the Maryland Line Confederate Soldiers' Home. He is also co-author of Baltimore During the Civil War and Marylanders in Blue. Mr. Toomey has lectured for a number of colleges, universities, and historical organizations, as well as the National Park Service and Smithsonian Institution. He has also contributed to radio and television programs and 2 Civil War battle videos. He served on the Maryland Military Monuments Commission and was project historian for the Maryland Memorial, erected at Gettysburg in 1994. Mr. Toomey has won numerous awards for his historical research and exhibits, including the Gettysburg National Battlefield Award in 1985 and a National Park Service Award at Fort McHenry in 2001. For his many accomplishments in the field of writing and preservation. He is currently the guest curator at Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Museum. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Daniel Carroll Toomey.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to thank Lisa for inviting me here today. I travel around the country, literally, and anytime I go to an event with 50 people, whatever it is, church, wedding, I don't care what it is, political, I say you've done well. You've got over 100 people here. You people are doing very well, and you should congratulate yourselves. This is no small accomplishment. Now, I realize that the focus of this organization is the Lower Eastern Shore, but what I'm going to do today is talk about the Eastern Shore. But I think it's important that you kind of know what happens across the county line, and with this information, perhaps you can find ways to interact, but appreciate the identity of the Eastern Shore. And I realize this is coming from somebody from across the bay, but anyway, I am sincere. What I'd like to do is, first off, really, a lot of people don't understand the Eastern Shore in terms of its Civil War identity, and that's what I want to preach to you, I guess, today. If you go back to 1860, the state of Maryland, to steal a phrase from Maryland tourism a long time ago, Maryland was the Civil War in miniature. And Maryland basically was divided into 4 distinct regions, other than your lower region here. The first region was Southern Maryland. That was the counties between the Potomac River and the Chesapeake Bay. That was the oldest area in the state, oldest settled area. It was devoid of manufacturing, no railroads. Its economy was the tobacco plantation. You had the fewest whites and the most slave population there. Then you have, the next section would be northern western Maryland. It's the counties around Baltimore west. Here you had the largest cities, you had the railroads, the industry, you had a diverse economy. Grain was a major crop as opposed to tobacco, and it was where most of the immigrants would settle. So this was quite a different area. I drop back just a second. So if you think of Southern Maryland, you could think of the Deep South. When you think of northwestern Maryland, you could think of the North. Now, when you look at Baltimore City, it simply can be described as a city with a northern personality, a northern economy and a southern personality. It was the largest industrial city in the South. And then, where we are today? The Eastern Shore. And I say this without any slight, but with intent to explain it. The Eastern Shore was mentally and physically separated from the rest of the state. The immigrants that arrived in Philadelphia and Baltimore either settled there or went west, but very few immigrants came this way. So the immigrant flow between the 1840s and the 1860s really didn't change the social makeup of the Eastern Shore. There was talk of secession on the Eastern Shore back as early as 1850 to secede from the state of Maryland, create a state along with the 2 Virginia counties on its own. So secession wasn't exactly a novel idea. There was a declining interest in slavery. By 1860, the black population on the Eastern Shore was 50% slave, 50% free. So I could compare the Eastern Shore with the Upper South, if you will. So you see, we had all the elements that the whole country had going into the war. Now, during the Revolutionary War, the Eastern Shore was a divided region. 50% just about loyal to the king, 50% rebels. And almost all military operations during the Revolutionary War were waged on the Eastern Shore. During the Civil War, it would be a divided region again. The first probable question, well, let's look at the election of 1860. I know we're all probably a little bit bored of politics right now, but this one you'll find interesting. As you know, Lincoln was not the first choice in the state of Maryland. He received less than 3,000 votes throughout the whole state. And on the Eastern Shore, he only received 93. In fact, two counties, Queen Anne's and Worcester, 0. So you get the idea that he wasn't the man. And also what this leads to is, what will Maryland do? Never forget, when you're talking to tourists, when you're talking to your in-laws, I don't care. Convince them of something, let them know. Maryland was a southern state. Southern state meant it was a slave state, and it was a border state, and a border state meant it was a divided region. And this history of Maryland during the Civil War cannot be matched by anybody else. They get close maybe in Kentucky or Missouri or Tennessee, but they can't match us, because we had one dynamic that scared the heck out of everybody in Washington. Don't forget, Maryland is the only southern state north of Washington, D.C. If Maryland secedes from the Union, the nation's capital is located behind enemy lines. Not a good way for Mr. Lincoln to start a war, and remember, he got less than 3,000 votes. So he really did worry about the state of Maryland. So the first question we might ask with all this divided region and thing then would be, well, who fought who, and who fought for who? And we look here on the shore. Now, because Maryland did remain in the Union, the recruiting of Union soldiers was an open act and organized and in the public. Those that wanted to support the Southern cause had to go underground. And believe me, they never got, they were underground, but that didn't mean they didn't get anything done. The Confederate Underground in the state of Maryland operated until after Lincoln's assassination. It's another interesting story that's really never been told. For the Union side, John A.J. Creswell from Cecil County was the Assistant Adjutant General and Supervisor of Enrollment for the state. Now, on the shore, 2 Union regiments were raised of infantry and 1 company of cavalry. The 1st Eastern Shore Infantry was organized in Cambridge, with companies coming from 4 different counties along the shore. Its commanding officer was Colonel James Wallace. Wallace was a lawyer from Cambridge here, Salisbury. Even though he enlisted in the Union Army, he was the regimental commander. He was a slave owner. Now, one of the things that you will find when you study the Civil War in Maryland is contradictions. That divided region theme, you can sell it. When I give lectures at Fort McHenry, I talk to people from all over the country just about Memorial Day, when I tell them, yes, Memorial Day is May 30th, and Confederate Memorial Day is June 6th. You have a Confederate Memorial Day? Yes, we do, and it's part of our history, and that's the key. It's our history. The 2nd Eastern Shore Infantry was organized at Camp Vickers near Chestertown. George Vickers was a U.S. Senator who convinced the Governor Hicks to create these Eastern Shore regiments as special units on the Eastern Shore. He was the promoter of this. They named a camp for him near Chestertown. 5 of the companies came from Kent County. But with all this, Vickers was still dead against emancipation. All the way to the end of the war, he opposed emancipation. He fought for the Union, but he was against emancipation. And the identity of a Marylander, excuse me a second. I talk to people from all over the place. When they walk up and say, oh, Maryland, you didn't do anything during the war. Oh, Maryland, you were neutral. Well, of course, my teeth hurt, but I don't say things because I'm on duty. But you really have to appreciate this conflict that's going on between what is a Marylander? Oversimplify this, but again, make people understand what's unique about our state, what's unique about our region. Firing on Fort Sumter, April 12, 1861. If you lived in Vermont and you read that in the newspaper the next day, you didn't have to think about it, you were a Yankee. If you lived in Mississippi and you read about it the next day, you didn't have to think about it, you were a rebel. In Maryland, A divided family is not a cliche, and we're going to see that through my presentation today. But this is a tremendous ordeal where Marylanders, in the essence, I'm giving you background. I realize it's not exactly a plaque or something, but I'd like you to have to get the essence of what we're talking about here. Marylanders had two overriding concepts. They wanted to stand by the Union. They wanted to support the Union, but they didn't want to go to war with Virginia. And that was the tear, and that's what all this, what helped separate all these families, as you'll see as we talk our way through here. The last unit I want to talk about is Smith's Independent Cavalry Company, which was organized in Snow Hill. Hundreds of other men crossed the state line, enlisted in Delaware, enlisted in Pennsylvania, crossed the bay, and enlisted in units within other Maryland units throughout the state. Now, when you get to 1863 and the Emancipation Proclamation, blacks can then be enlisted in the Union Army. The state of Maryland raised 6 regiments of black troops known as United States Colored Troops. 6 regiments from Maryland. Plus, there was another one, the 38th USCT. We got this one stolen away from us. What happened was they sent boats from Norfolk. They came up the lower bay, both sides of the bay, and they recruited blacks off the oyster fleets, off the plantations, took them around, and formed the regiment in Norfolk, so it doesn't get credited to Maryland. But about 90% of the manpower are Marylanders. So you see there's this other great contribution to the cause. On the political front, the first wartime governor was Thomas Holiday Hicks of Cambridge. I serve on the Military Monuments Commission. We restore monuments. About a year ago, Governor Hicks was totally green. Now he's white again. We maintain, we repair, and we promote Maryland military monuments wherever they are. Henry H. Goldsborough was comptroller and president of the Constitutional Convention that abolished slavery in 1864. He was also from Eastern Maryland. What I'm going to do is give you a rundown of who's who during the Civil War, and you're going to, I think, possibly be a little surprised just how many of those guys you can claim here on the shore. Now, as far as Confederate recruits were concerned, like I said, it was very active, but it had to be done underground. Volunteers were moved throughout the counties. They were moved to the Bay region. They were often shuttled by unemployed oystermen because oystering was a big industry, but the Civil War kind of took that back until after the waters calmed down again. So a number of these old oystermen were running across the bay with contraband and recruits for the Confederate Army. Once they got across the bay to Virginia, most Marylanders formed either in Richmond, Virginia, or Harper's Ferry, and they would collect to create units that would then be officially accepted into the Confederate Army. Now, one unit with a great connection to your area here is the 4th Artillery, also known as the Chesapeake Battery. It fought at 2nd Manassas, Fredericksburg, Gettysburg. So it was quite active with a great number of men here from this region. Another unit, of course, is the 1st Maryland Infantry. At the Battle of Gettysburg on July 1st, 1863, the 1st Maryland Infantry, CSA, attacked Culp Hill, where the 1st Eastern Shore Infantry was defending it. And we talk about divided families, and this is a good example. You had Sergeant P.M. Moore from Trapp, Maryland, was a flag bearer in the Confederate 1st Maryland, and his cousin was Robert Ross, was a flag bearer in the 1st Eastern Shore. So, talk about, defending opposite flags. They took that literally. Then this surprised me, and for what it's worth, I take a look at the Confederate High Command from the Eastern Shore. General Arnold Elzey was born in Somerset County. When the war began, he resigned his commission in the regular army and became the first colonel of the 1st Maryland Infantry Regiment. Wounded in 1862, he was promoted to Major General. General Charles S. Winder was born in Talbot County. He was killed in action at the Battle of Cedar Mountain in 1862 while commanding the famous Stonewall Brigade. He's buried at the Y Plantation Cemetery. General John H. Winder served as Provost Marshal of Richmond and later Commandant of the infamous Andersonville Prison. He wisely dropped dead right at the end of the war before he could be indicted for anything. General Lloyd Tillman from Talbot County was killed in action at the Battle of Champions Hill in 1863. Franklin Buchanan was the first commander of the United States Naval Academy and the first admiral of the Confederate States Navy. He was also from Talbot County and is buried at Y Plantation. Now here's one I think I'm going to get you on. How many people know John W. Bromwell? John W. Bramwell, Trapp, Maryland, Talbot County. He served as a secretary to Judah P. Benjamin, who was a member of Jeff Davis's cabinet. When Richmond fell in 1865, Benjamin and Bromwell escaped together from Richmond. They went all the way down through the South. They went to Cuba, and finally they reached England. The entire time he traveled, he was carrying the Great Seal of the Confederacy with him. So he would be a hometown hero to some people. The thing I like to stress, and I look at history as Maryland history. I don't have any one part, regardless of what Russell will tell you. I love it all. But you have to give the devil their due. And any Confederate soldier that served from Maryland was a volunteer. He didn't get drafted. He didn't only get drafted. He had to make his way across the Chesapeake Bay, enlist, and give up everything he had and be cut off probably until the end of the war to ever come home again. So, like I said, give them the devil their due. And I'd like to just introduce you to one Confederate volunteer from the Eastern Shore. His name is Joseph F. Ridaway. He was from Easton, Talbot County. He was the son of a prominent merchant and sea captain who owned several ships. Joseph acquired his seamanship papers at the age of 16, so he knew what he was doing. In 1862, he ran the blockade. He enlisted in the Confederate States Navy. In the fall of 1863, he volunteered to serve on the Confederate submarine, the CSS Hunley. Ridaway was serving as second in command when the third and final crew was lost after sinking the USS Housatonic. So he was part of the crew, first successful submarine attack in naval history, February 17th, 1864. He's also the only member of the Hunley's crew that was positively identified through a DNA analysis. So we got a little CSI thrown in. Well, I'm sure everyone's sitting on the edge of their chair saying, well, what happened on the Eastern Shore? Gettysburg, Antietam, Sherman's March to the Sea, what do we got to sell? I'm not going to lie to you. You don't have a lot of big battles. But you have a lot of very interesting events, and I'm just going to tick a couple off because I know I don't have a lot of time today to do the whole thing. But I want to talk to you, 1861, the occupation of Accomack and Northampton counties. Now, this is an interesting story. As you know, you got two Virginia counties over here, which, to me doesn't make sense, but that's how history works. Of course, they were loyal to the Confederacy, and they were sending troops and supplies, but also they're here. So they're interacting with their adjacent counties and bringing contraband through. Of course, the Union side says, well, this isn't good. This could stir up insurrection on the Eastern Shore. We got to do something about it. General John A. Dix was the department commander in Maryland, and he looked at the situation and he decided that he would put an end to this, but he would do it in a very reverse manner, so to speak. He would create an attack force commanded by General Henry Lockwood from Delaware. It had a Delaware regiment, had a Maryland regiment, had regiments from about 5 other states. And he would put them out of business. But what he was going to do was he was going to do it in a very kid glove kind of way. He announced the invasion of these two counties. He said, I'm coming in, I'm going to put the end of this blockade running. If nobody opposes me, I will not use any force. And he was hoping that he could get the two Virginia counties to possibly agree to leave Virginia and join Maryland. That would have been a little kicker there for that. But he made it clear. He said, we're not going to alienate your rights. We're going to respect your property rights, which at this time meant their slaves, which being Virginians would be something that they would be considered about. So they begin this advance with 4,500 men on November 17th from that new town near the Virginia state line. And as they advanced, every day they announced where they were going. They moved about 10 miles a day, and it was all planned out where Lockwood would advise people where he was going to be next. I mean, can you imagine D-Day with Eisenhower saying to Hitler, I'm coming in on June 6th. Just the opposite. He's advancing. Here I come. Well, as they approach the Virginia first line of defense, the fortifications are empty. The militia have wisely retreated. They were poorly armed. They had most of their weapons were left over from the War of 1812. They even had one cannon from the Revolutionary War, so they weren't really good shape to fight anyway. The commanding officer of the whole thing, Colonel Charles Smith, realized he didn't stand a chance. So he told the militia to disband, and he put about 100 men on a ship, sailed over to Norfolk, and enlisted in a different Confederate unit. So the first military operation on the Eastern Shore, and one of the first military operations of the Civil War, was a complete success. General Dick's plan worked perfectly. Complete victory. No battles, no skirmishes, and no casualties. Anybody knows the Civil War realizes that General McClellan would have loved that because he didn't like doing the enemy. Okay, let's look at 1862. This goes to the heart. When I wrote the Civil War in Maryland in 1863, I was going to write a military history. And then, of course, there was a lot of days, and I started back filling in, and I looked at political arrests and newspapers. And I realized that everybody that lived in the state of Maryland was a Civil War veteran, not just the guys that wore the uniforms. And this will show just one example of that. And again, it's something you can key in on. The arrest of Judge Carmichael. Now, Judge Carmichael was in the court in Easton, and he was pro-Southern in his leanings, and he tended to leave people off. Plus, he refused to enforce some of the illegal directions he was getting from the department commander. Well, the department commander at that time was John A. Dix, who was a real handful anyway. And so he sent McPhail, his provost marshal, with some detectives, backed up by 125 soldiers. And during court in Easton, the detectives marched right into court while it's being held, and McPhail told the judge that he was under arrest. Now, the judge thought he knew something about the law. That's why they made him a judge. And he says, well, the United States Army doesn't have any jurisdiction in my civilian court. And, where's your papers and so forth? They said, we don't need any. They grabbed him by the arms, beat him over the head, drug him out of the court, threw him on a boat, and took him to prison at Fort McHenry. Now, this is where you get into being a proud Marylander. Even the Unionists in Maryland were outraged at this, went to the Lincoln, and demanded the removal of Dix from office, which he was within a month's time. That's another key story to the personality of Marylanders during the Civil War. I can give you example after example where we were Marylanders first, and then we were Rebs and Yanks. I won't have time for that today, but trust me. So this just gives you an idea of what it was like. Now, I also mentioned about divided families and the problem. Part of the detachment that went to arrest Judge Carmichael was a Captain William C. Spencer. William C. Spencer was the judge's nephew. He was a captain in the regular army. When he got to the front door of the courthouse, he stopped. He says, I will not take part in this. He was pretty well dressed down by the general and resigned his commission before the end of the year, but he would not arrest his uncle. That's the kind of predicaments we were in Maryland, and I dare say not too many people in Vermont had that kind of a problem. Skipping along here, 1864. This is another thing that especially your tourists come in from out of state. Everybody knows the Emancipation Proclamation, January 1st, 1863. All slaves are free. Wherever there is an area of rebellion, the state of Maryland did not secede from the Union. The state of Maryland was not an area of rebellion, and the Emancipation Proclamation did not take effect in the state. So even though slaves were free in Virginia, slavery was still as legal as a parking ticket in Maryland, okay? It took the Constitutional Convention of 1864 to rewrite the Constitution in order to legally abolish slavery in the state. Now, we all know that the way things were going, it wasn't going to work out very well for the slave owners anyway, but the point is, by the letter of the law, it was still legal until November of 1864. Maryland just has its own Civil War story to tell. Last but not least, 1865, Lincoln assassination. General John R. Kennedy was commander of the Delmarva region, and when Lincoln was assassinated, he put out an immediate bulletin, Special Order Number 5, that said there was no, let's stay calm. If there's any insurrection, I will put it down, but I don't want to do that. And the people here did not overreact. They did not. They were only cooler heads prevailed. No Confederate operations tried to cause any problem, and so there was no military action following or trouble following Lincoln's assassination. I mean, you can really thank John R. Kennedy, the most famous Marylander you never met. That's another lecture for another day. I'd like to conclude something because I think it ties into your tourist business, and it also, educates people from the other side of the bridge, so to speak. That's the veterans period. I'm a real spokesman, you might say, for the Civil War veterans. I really have a soft part in my heart for them. You all know the Civil War lasted 4 years, 1861 through 1865. No big deal. The veterans period lasted 75 years. 75 years, these guys were first, and something to appreciate. When the war ended, Appomattox, whatever date you want to pick, there were over 1 million men in the United States Army on active duty. That's a big army. I mean, there wasn't probably 1 million people in the United States during the Revolutionary War. So you understand this is a big deal. And of course you had hundreds of thousands of Confederate veterans. Immediately following the war, this group of veterans, Union and Confederate, were at first a tremendous economic and politically active group, you can imagine. The Grand Army Republic had at one time 400,000 members. With an extended family, no wonder they got 5 members in the White House. The point is, but they were very important. And then at the end of their day, that 75-year period, the last reunion at Gettysburg, they were a beloved element of our society, just like our World War II vets today with the honor flights. It was the same thing. And of course, they were going rapidly. So I like to preach about the veterans period and what they did. And what I like to do is just give a brief overview of some of the Civil War monuments on the shore that you can connect with. As I mentioned, the Governor Hicks Monument in Cambridge. You've got a monument to the Union soldiers in Federalsburg. In Chestertown, there's a monument listing the names of soldiers who fought in both armies, which is the way Civil War history in Maryland should be presented. 37 Confederate, 152 Union. The Frederick Douglass Monument to Courthouse in Easton, along with the monument to Confederate soldiers from Talbot County. Now, the veterans of the USCT regiments were also very active on the Eastern Shore. They founded the community of Unionville, and they also founded Scott's United Methodist Church on Main Street. Both of these in Talbot County. The Methodist Church is in Trout. In the post-war years, the Grand Army of the Republic, which was the largest Civil War veterans organization, north or south, was segregated, just like the United States Army was until after World War II. And so they had separate GAR posts. In Chestertown, the Charles Sumner Post number 25 was formed by black veterans in that area. The Charles Sumner Hall, the Grand Army Republic, is still in existence. It's been preserved and it still exists. And I don't know if you've ever seen my friend Michael Crutcher. He does an impersonation of Frederick Douglass. And if he walked in this room today, you would all swear it was Frederick Douglass. And Mike goes all over the United States and goes to Europe, and he does a tremendous job. And I said, Mike, I said, in your travels, have you ever seen a black GAR post anywhere in the United States? He says, no way, you got it. So again, we've got something to be proud of there. And last but not least, I want to talk about that 75th reunion at Gettysburg, because you've got a connection there too. By the time 1938, the federal government and the state of Pennsylvania invited every living Civil War veteran in the United States at their expense to come for one final reunion. Didn't matter north or south, didn't matter whether you're in the battle or not, but they all came. And 22 Marylanders came that were logged in as Marylanders to that 75th reunion. 2 of them came from the Eastern Shore. One was Lambert Highland, who had served in Smith's Independent Cavalry Company, I mentioned earlier, and the other was Isaiah Fawcett of the 9th USCT. Highland was the last surviving veteran of Salisbury, Maryland, and Fawcett had been born a slave near Berlin before emancipation, before slavery ended. His owner took him to the recruiting station, enlisted him in the Union Army. The slave owner got $300 bounty money. The United States Army got a soldier, and Fawcett got his freedom. And he survived the war and went on to be very active in the Veterans Affairs. I've given you just a real quick overview of things. I would tell you, though, something I believe, that the story of the Civil War on the Eastern Shore is yet to be told. It's a book yet to be written, and I hope you'll capitalize on some of the talking points I've given you today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Toomey, for reminding us that our heritage is both educational and enjoyable.